Well, today I am speaking with Julie Behling, and Julie is the author of a book called Beneath Sheep's Clothing. Is that right?
Yes.
And it's fascinating subject. It's about communism and the relationship between the Soviet communist takeover and what we're seeing today in this country. And Julie, would you just start by introducing yourself and telling a little bit about the book and about the documentary project that you're working on from that?
Sure. Yeah. So in the late 90s, I was a missionary in Russia, and it was a wonderful experience, very intense experience. I came back to the States and I got a dual master's in Russian and East European studies and Russian language and literature. And for my Russian and East European studies degree, I ended up writing a thesis, a master's thesis. And I actually decided to write my thesis on underground Christian movements in the Soviet Union and their survival tactics and the tactics of the Soviet state to try to demolish them and to demolish Christianity and religion in general. And there were three main tactics that I really discovered that I really focused on for my thesis. And I focused on the period from the end of World War II up until Perestroika, which was the most sophisticated set of tactics. The early tactics that the Soviets used against religion were very brutal and actually ended up backfiring. I mean, it was mass arrest, mass execution, and imprisonment, and it ended up breeding a lot of underground religious activity. So I focused on the latter part of the Soviet Union, and yeah, so I did that. That was over 20 years ago that I began working on my thesis, and then I set all my materials aside, moved on with my life, and in 2008 there was something that happened that was in the news, and that really kind of struck me in a very interesting way. It was um, a religious fringe group in the United States that no one liked, that everyone considered to be a cult. They experienced some of the same types of treatment that I wrote about in my thesis that the underground Christian movements in the Soviet Union experienced. And that was they experienced an armed militarized raid at the hands of the government. But in this case, it wasn't the Soviet government, it was the government here in America. They had all their children forcibly removed without due process, I should say, or due cause, and were just had this brutal arm of the government against them. And there was a massive wave of propaganda against them, some of which was true, and some of it which was trumped up. And it looked like they were trying to be destroyed. And so it looked exactly like the types of things I researched with the underground Baptists and Pentecostals in the Soviet Union, Seventh-day Adventists. So I began researching and I began seeing that all the three major tactics that I researched for my thesis that the Soviets used to destroy Christianity were all in place in America
Hmm.
and had been in some cases for over a century. So that was the genesis of my book, Beneath Sheep's Clothing. The subtitle is The Communist Takeover of Culture in the USSR and Parallels in Today's America. So I was able to finally publish my book last year, and now we're working on the documentary based on my book.
Wow, wow, so many questions I have for you about that. So the 2008 group, that was a polygamous group in
Yes.
I can't remember, it wasn't Utah, was it?
No, it was the FLDS, Fundamentalist LDS in Texas at
In
the El Dorado.
Texas. That's what I thought. Yeah. Okay. Interesting. And so what were the three tactics that you were observing?
Yeah. So in my thesis, the three tactics that the Soviets used, again, first was anti-religious propaganda and pro-communist, pro-Soviet propaganda.
That's
Broad,
all one.
yes,
That's okay.
that's
Anti-religious,
one tactic.
pro-communist. Okay.
Yeah, all throughout society. So throughout the education, throughout media, entertainment, throughout the fine arts, throughout all aspects that they could control, the culture was broadly anti-religious, pro-socialist slash communist. The second tactic was, instead of what the Soviets did in this first few decades of the Soviet Union, which is again persecute all Christians, arrests and mass arrests, mass executions. They kind of went hands off with the mainstream organizations that registered with the government, and they focused their efforts. They kept the heavy armed tactics only on the fringe Christian groups,
Okay.
fringe religious groups that nobody liked and everybody considered to be cults. And in the Soviet Union, that was, there were different branches. There were different types of Baptists. There were some that went with the government, and then there was some that broke off and were like, no. To be able to go with the government, you had to like agree that, you couldn't baptize children. Or if someone wanted to get baptized into your church, they had to like sign up with the government first and have a 3-year waiting period. I mean, there were a lot of really heavy restrictions. And so the ones that did not want the government interfering in their religious practices, they had to go underground. And these were the groups that they still received raids on their meetings. They had their children taken forcibly and put in, state-run atheist foster care. They, would go to the gulag, arrests, and sent, prison sentences to the gulag. They would be, some of them, forcibly interred in psychiatric institutions and forcibly given psychotropic drugs because of their religious delusions when they were things like
retraining.
that. Yes. And then the third tactic, which is the one that was most successful, well, they were all very successful. This was the actual literal infiltration of the churches with KGB agents posing as clergy.
Oh, interesting.
And this began in the 1960s. And so for all of the churches that were, again, registered with the government or not, they all experienced this infiltration to some degree or another. The Russian Orthodox Church, very heavily infiltrated, and others to different degrees. So those were the three tactics.
So you are observing these in action, and you observed them around the time of the FLDS. So anti-religious, pro-communist propaganda, I feel like I can see that. I see what you're saying. I think that we have seen quite a bit of that. But will you give some examples of how you see that showing up in culture?
Yeah. So in my book, I go into primarily I look at K through 12 education, but of course I have to mention higher education, which was subverted first. Well, I mean, I kind of had to work my way backwards through all of this and sift through go down lots of different rabbit holes. But I go through the 10 ways in which America's education went from being an education that produced pro-freedom Christians, that, pro-family individuals and hard workers and, fairly well-educated people by the standard of the world, to what we have going on now, which is anything but that. We had a few players, heavy-hitting players at the very beginning of the 20th century, investing massive amounts of money into education. This is Rockefeller Foundation, Carnegie Foundation, individuals. They were investing more in America's education than the government was. And they were importing tactics from Prussia to kind of treating students as animals, like the rat in the cage with, here's the pellet when you push the button, and then you get electric
conditioning.
shock. Yes, operant conditioning. So it started out with that, moving on to the teachers' unions becoming these hardcore leftist organizations, going all, of course, there was the push to remove Christianity from the schools, which, going back, back to the 19th century and before, the schools were very, very deeply intertwined with Christianity. And so they had to extricate that. They had to, get the Christianity out first and then bring in the secular humanism, which seemed fairly innocuous at first. And now we've gone from promoting secular humanism in the schools to this full-on woke Marxist insanity. And that's, the wokeism is a whole topic in and of itself, of having infiltrated the schools, which for someone like myself, I graduated from high school in the early 90s, and I had a fairly good public school experience, like better than average, I think. And then I have a son now. I had my son later in life, and he just started kindergarten in 2019. So I was not really aware of what was going on in education for quite a number of years, and now I'm homeschooling him, but did not have my finger on the pulse of this downward slide with the woke Marxism. Well, what are some other major tactics? There were efforts to dumb the students down, though, starting much earlier in the 20th century, changing reading away from like a phonics training to some things that were much less effective,
Mm-hmm.
different efforts to dumb down the way math has been taught.
Mm-hmm.
And there's many different cans of worms there. But
So
then
you
you
would put
also,
that under anti-religious and pro-communist propaganda in the education system?
well, the dumbing down
Mm-hmm.
is connected with that, yes.
Well, if the stated purpose of the public school or the compulsory schooling institutional project is to create effective and obedient workers, which it is to create a good workforce. It's not in order to create independent thinkers. It's to have a steady supply of workers for the country. So dumbing down is a part of that, which seems like an inherently collective project.
Yes. Going back to the anti-religious, I mean, you really look at pop culture and entertainment, and you see a very successful campaign, if you want to call it that, with that. I mean, one of the things I discuss in the book, just looking at the treatment of Christians or Christian clergy in pop culture. I'm actually watching Little House on the Prairie with my son right now. It was the show that I watched growing up. And there's actually the Reverend in that show is portrayed in a positive light. And it's like kind of shocking, actually, because you don't see that anymore. To looking at like mainstream treatment of Christians, and there's basically three main motifs. There's the crazed lunatic, murderous Christian clergyman. There's like the nerdy, geeky, kind of lovable, but like kind of out of touch with reality Christian portrayal. And then there's like the hyper controlling cult parent trying to control their kid, like Footloose, and you see this throughout pop culture. And now, I mean, I don't think you could even, unless it's, movies that are made by Christians, you don't see any positive portrayal of Christians. And you haven't for decades. So,
okay. So yeah, I can see those. Those are good examples of the anti-religious and pro-communist. And so when you say focus on the fringe, that's your second, the second tactic that you identify as broad tactic. I can see how focusing on the fringe could force anybody who's afraid of also being targeted to comply more with a central orthodoxy. Is that kind of the idea behind that?
100%. Yeah, and then we get to go further back. I have a chapter in my book on the treatment of the FLDS and what happened there. And I don't condone, I don't have the same views as the FLDS, and I do think Warren Jeffs is probably a sociopath. The guy's bad news. He's the head of the was the head of the FLDS. I also have a chapter in my book on the Branch Davidians.
Okay.
Which actually researching that was, and I don't also agree with tenets that the Branch Davidians espoused, but
I remember when that happened. Oh, yeah. So shocking.
That actually, out of everything that I researched for my book, was the most heartbreaking and shocking what happened with them. And basically, the forensic evidence looks like the government killed these people.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I guess when you say without due process, that seems like the key right there.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, David Koresh could have been taken to task on, like statutory rape. He was engaging in sexual relations with like 14-year-old girls with their parents' permission. That's pretty marginal, but the group was not a threat. They were not going to be unleashing their weapons on their community around them. They were a very small fringe little group in the middle of rural Texas. They were not going to be a threat to anyone.
Yeah, they were all killed by the government.
And the ones that weren't killed, the few that escaped, were given extremely punitive sentences in imprisonment, and way, way beyond the pale what happened with them. A lot of the children murdered and burned to death. And so and then the day after they were killed, Bill Clinton comes out. Let me read the quote, actually. This is pretty telling. The day
what
after.
Year was that?
1993.
93. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. This was the day after these people were torched to death. Bill Clinton comes out. This is a quote. "I am very sorry for the loss of life which occurred at the beginning and at the end of this tragedy in Waco. I hope very much that others who will be tempted to join cults and to become involved with people like David Koresh will be deterred by the horrible scenes they have seen over the last 7 weeks."
Wow.
So,
Wow. That's really blatant.
then you go and you
Let
look,
that be a lesson to you.
yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, it's a cautionary tale. And then
Mhm.
you go and you can see the C-SPAN footage in Congress of, because it was pretty obvious that the Bureau of Alcohol and Tobacco that had
Mhm.
enacted this raid against them, that they had been in the wrong. And so there
Mhm.
was a trial in Congress, and, you know, a couple of attorneys that had been attorneys for some of the Branch Davidians were there.
Mhm.
And there were a lot of people, saying, look, the government, what did you do? You don't just go and what did you do to these people? And there were 4 senators in particular that
Mhm.
you can watch them on tape. They're saying, nope, they killed them. They killed their own children. They killed themselves, with no evidence for that.
Mhm.
And they just kept going back to that narrative. And those 4 senators, Chuck Schumer was one of them.
Mhm.
Joe Biden was one of them. Orrin Hatch, who was a Utah senator, and then John Conyers, who was a Michigan senator. There was
Mhm.
these 4 that they were trying to control the narrative within that
Oh,
trial.
wow.
So I
Wow.
found that very interesting as well.
That is interesting.
One more aspect to this, if you
Mhm.
remember Vince Foster, who was an aide to the Clintons, who had gone to the park and shot himself.
Mhm. Mhm.
He did this in response to the tragedy at Waco. And
Okay.
his widow said that he felt personally responsible for what happened, and he could not reconcile the deaths of those people, especially the children. And he wrote a lengthy letter explaining all of this, and then went and shot himself. But that letter disappeared. Hillary Clinton's aides went in and
Okay.
took that, and
Wow.
was never seen. So there's a lot that we don't know
Mhm.
about what happened there. But this happened right after the Clintons got into office.
Okay. Okay. So that's a really strong example. Those 2 examples, Waco and FLDS, are
Yeah.
the examples of without using due process of law, going in and exterminating or cracking down on fringe groups, which
Yeah.
pushes people towards the center, which is
Yes.
more controllable.
Yes.
And then your third tactic that you gave was infiltration, with agents.
Yeah.
Now, is that actually happening? Are the churches being infiltrated by Marxist actors, or
Yes.
okay,
Yeah. And they have been for over a century.
okay,
This process began in the early 20th century. 1920s especially began to ramp up. Again, funded by Rockefeller Foundation, funding literal communists to go in to the seminaries,
Mm.
and then in some cases take charge of the seminaries where clergy were being trained. Kind of the same model as what happened with the
With
takeover of
education.
higher education.
Okay.
You take over the training centers first. And so then what they would do, and I mean, I can give you names, it's all out there,
Mm.
um, is they started by kind of changing the doctrines,
Mhm.
these seminaries, to make Christianity more reconcilable with socialism, demythologizing. And so, oh, Jesus wasn't really born of a virgin birth. That's kind of, that's just like an allegory. So demythologizing Christianity within the seminaries, it's a little bit shocking for that to be a place where such a thing takes place. And then promoting what's called the social gospel. Um, let me show you the sins of the social gospel. Because, and this again, this has been going on for over a century with the National Council of Churches. The National Council of Churches, um, which a lot of mainline Christian sects belong to it. By the mid 20th century, about half of America's Christian churches were subverted quite heavily from the top down with
By the mid
communism.
20th century.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Um, and then it's only gotten worse since then. Um, we have Harry F. Ward. He was called the Red Dean. He was a dean of the seminary, and he was not didn't hide the fact that he was communist.
Hmm.
He was kind of a ringleader. He was funded by the Rockefellers. Joseph Fletcher, he taught at Episcopal Theological College beginning in 1944. He was also a communist. He participated with Communist Party USA. He helped found Planned Parenthood.
Okay. Wow.
He was a eugenicist. And then he actually ended up leaving Christianity and becoming an open communist.
Hmm.
He was Humanist of the Year in 1974. He was a signer of the Humanist Manifesto, a member of the American Eugenics Association, a lovely individual. I'm trying to find, okay, here we go. Walter Rauschenbusch, I can't pronounce that right. He was an early one. He was the individual who came up with the social gospel, and basically taking Christianity and twisting it to be now an arm of social justice. So instead of making Christianity a faith where one is to get to know God and to become reconciled to God through Jesus, which I think that's what Christianity is.
Mm-hmm.
Wrong, but instead of that, it's no longer a relationship with God and a reconciliation with God. It's a social justice vehicle.
Okay.
And it's easy, I think, it was easy to kind of twist that in people's minds, because service to humanity and service to the underprivileged is absolutely a part of Christianity. But to make it exclusively that, and then let me see if I can find this quote. Well, he talked about the 6 or 7 sins. Okay, the 6 sins of social injustice. Okay, yeah, he said, Rauschenbusch, Jesus didn't die for the sins of man, but for the 6 sins of social injustice. And one of those sins is class contempt.
Wow.
Really Marxist.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
And so you turn away from worries about sins and redemption to just doing good deeds and helping the poor and oppressed.
Okay.
So that was for that. And so I wrote most of my book from 2009 to 2011. And then in 2021, I was like, I really have to finish my book now. And then I had to catch it up to modern times. And I was shocked and horrified to see that now evangelical churches in the last decade have been heavily subverted from the top down.
What was it before? If it wasn't evangelical, what were the churches that were being subverted?
Well, the churches that belong to the National Council of Churches, Episcopal, Presbyterian, Methodist, Orthodox, AME, and then we have with the Black churches, we have Black Liberation Theology, which is explicitly Marxist. That was also a big thing that happened.
Okay.
Still is happening.
I'll just tell you my own kind of background with regard to this is that I didn't grow up going to church. I grew up, both parents had difficult relationships with religion as kids and had decided to raise us without doing that, without church. There was a period of time where I considered myself an atheist just because I got so much pressure from the Christians. I lived in South Texas. There's a lot of pressure from Christians and Catholics, and a lot of like, you're going to hell and you don't believe right. And so I felt my impression of Christianity was really oppressive. That was my impression, was it's bullying and it's hypocritical and it says it's about love, but these people are so mean. And so I had a really bad taste in my mouth about Christianity and religion in general until I went to university. I went to a Catholic university and I had to actually engage with the Bible firsthand. I had to really read the New Testament. I developed a much more open mind about it. And I've considered myself to be in a place of openness and seeking since then, but I don't consider myself necessarily a Christian or not. I don't really know. So that's just me on the table. I'm probably going to get a lot of flack for that, but whatever, it's fine. That's just where I am. I've tried out churches over my adult life, and I've gone to some for as many as a couple of years, but it's never been I have just a complicated relationship with it. So I don't come from a Christian perspective. I'm not, but I'm also not hostile towards it. So I'm open-minded to what you have to say. And I think it's interesting that you're framing this as it sounds like, and correct me and help me to refine this if I'm wrong, but it sounds like your perspective on the communist takeover is that it's explicitly and overtly anti-Christian. first and foremost. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, Christianity is the main ideological threat to communism.
Mhm.
And with Christianity being such a dominant ideology throughout the world, yeah, it had to be subverted very
Mhm.
heavily.
Mhm.
So
Well, there are certain things that, in terms of valuing life and love and family and certain values that have been a part of Western culture.
yeah.
It's I find that as I try to understand what the moral underpinning for these things would be, I come back to religion over and over again.
Mhm.
And I don't want to say that there's no secular underpinning, there's no possible secular underpinning, because I don't know, but I keep coming back to religion as a backbone for a lot of those things, and Christian Judeo-Christian values as the underpinning for those things.
Yes.
And what I do see is that the communist movement, the cultural takeover, is explicitly materialist and
Yeah.
hedonistic and doesn't value life. And I'm interested. What are your thoughts on that? What do you would you say a little bit about that if you have thoughts on that?
Yeah. No, I 100% agree with you. And not only that, communism cannot handle there to be a God above the leader of the state and the system, the communist system. Has to be the God and the church. There can't
Mhm.
be a competing power structure for that. And so, even just alone on that, Christianity is a huge threat. Of course, the family is a huge threat. Um, but yeah, I mean, I see communism as the antithesis. It's like an inversion of Christianity. And it purports to be all these good things. Oh, we're going to take care of the least among us will be fed and clothed and housed. But then there's no regard for life. There's no regard for individual rights. I just watched a documentary on Sunday. This is what I do in my spare time, about the one child policy in China. It's on Amazon Prime. It's a good documentary. I highly recommend it. It's horrifying.
What was it called?
Oh my gosh, I don't know.
It's okay. If you think of it, you can send me a link and I'll
One
put it in
child
the thing.
policy. I'll send you the link.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
it's a recent documentary, and it's a woman, a Chinese woman, Chinese American, going back to China and investigating this. And she had her own family members just talking about, oh yeah, I had a baby, and we just left the baby in the marketplace, and the baby starved. Oops, there was nothing we could do. The government just made us. And then the midwives, the village midwives, were abortionists. They aborted babies regularly, 8 to 9 months along.
Wow.
And like, you would find fetuses in garbage bags and garbage
God.
all over the place. I mean, the amount of disregard for life. And the
Yeah.
people today, I mean, this documentary is very recent.
Hmm.
They don't even feel much remorse. I mean, a part of them does.
Yeah. Well, they probably
Oh,
can't reconcile that. It's probably too dark for them to even go there.
it's just unbelievable. And I even
Huh.
living in Russia in the late 90s, so it's a few years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, I just saw so many relics of a complete disregard for human life and humanity. And the Russian people are not bad people. They're actually, I say, they're more caring and for their people in their inner circle, more generous than
Hmm.
Americans are, and
Hmm.
very giving people. But like on a scale, like just out in a city street, you would just see this like just disregard for human suffering.
Yeah.
It's unreal that is beaten out of people.
Well,
Um,
I will say that one of the things that shocked me most in the discourse in the last couple of years, especially with the abortion debate, whether or not you agree on whether there's some period of time when an abortion is a reasonable thing to consider, whether or not you agree that there's possible in first trimester, whatever.
right.
The idea that it's now sweeping through that it's okay to abort a late term baby and even up to birth, I just can't fathom that that's a thing.
It's insane. And it really is like they would fit right in China,
Hmm.
like
Hmm.
the people who don't have a problem with that.
Hmm. Well, I guess just one little aside. I think when I say that looking for a moral underpinning and coming back to religion, I should refine that and say that I think I come back to spirituality. And
Mhm,
I'm not sure that it has to be a specific religion, but I
mhm.
come back to something that's spiritual and it's not material and it's not based on anything that we can discern with our materialist and rational minds. It's something more ethereal, and it's a basis. It's a love of life and the essence of life,
But it's
which is
also
something spiritual.
Judeo
Hmm.
Christian ethics, though. It all comes back to that too.
Hmm.
Our society is built on Judeo Christian ethics, and any any kind of belief system that is not compatible with Judeo Christian ethics has not been able to. It is not compatible with America. But except now, um, we have this onslaught of woke Marxism,
Hmm.
which is not compatible, in my opinion, with Judeo Christian ethics. So.
When you were speaking with Cara Bartholomew, Cara Marcel, I saw your interview with her.
Mhm,
You were talking. You guys did a really good dissection of Yuri Besmanov's
mhm,
um, his warnings to the American people.
yeah.
Would you mind walking me through that?
Yeah, definitely. So for those who aren't familiar, and everyone should go watch this on YouTube, Yuri Bezmenov was a KGB agent, a Soviet KGB agent, a propagandist who defected from the Soviet Union in the late 70s. He defected to the West, I believe Canada. And then he was trying to warn. It was literally his job. He was actually stationed in India, and it was his job to like slowly get in and propagandize to the people of India. And he knew the tactics well. And so in this video, it was recorded by G. Edward Griffin, this interview in, I believe, 1985. And there's also a few other videos with him, but he goes through 4 steps to subvert a society, from a free society or a freer society to communist. And he lays it all out. And this was his job. And he claimed that 80% of the KGB's efforts went towards this process of ideological subversion in the nations of the world. That espionage was really just a small, that's like the more like, oh, James Bond type thing, really interesting. But really, it was this ideological subversion of the propagandists that was really the main foundation of their efforts. Because again, communism, it's not content with a nation becoming communist. It has to be a worldwide global movement. That is what they've always pushed for.
Mhm.
So the 4 steps, he lays it all out. Step one is demoralization, and he said that it takes between, I believe it's 15 to 20 to 30 years to demoralize a society. It's 1 or 2 generations of school kids. So you're
Mm.
in the schools, and you're training them to be supportive of the ideology of their enemy, which in this case is socialism. And he said that as of 1985, America was way overfulfilled with this
Mm.
step one.
Mm.
That it was beyond overfulfilled, beyond their wildest dreams. They could not have imagined how successful this demoralization would have been in America.
And when you say demoralization, I think removal of meaning and
Mm-hmm.
removal of agency.
Mm-hmm.
And what else?
Well, I mean, part of demoralization is a literal erosion of the morals
Hmm.
of the people. And there are several quotes from different Soviet actors, including, I think, Khrushchev, or Khrushchev is how we pronounce it in America, himself, that they had to go in and kind of degrade the morals, the sexual morals of the young
Mm.
people.
Hmm.
Get
Hmm.
young
Okay.
people interested in casual sex, and
Yeah.
remove, and get people kind of interested in the material and instead of the spiritual.
Hmm.
Um, Going into the arts and making the arts ugly,
Hmm.
like
Yeah.
ugly sculpture instead of beautiful,
Yeah.
uplifting sculpture.
Yeah.
I mean,
Even our architecture looks disposable.
oh yeah. And
Hmm.
so there's a whole list of those types
Hmm.
of things. But to take the young people of a society and make them look upon socialism in a friendly manner.
Hmm.
And at this point now, what percentage of young people don't look upon socialism in a
Hmm.
positive light? I think there's very few at this point, with like high school, college age young people. So, but 1985, way overfulfilled. Step two is destabilization. And he said it took between 2 to 5 years to destabilize the nation. So once they've been sufficiently demoralized, then you go in and destabilize the main institutions of that society. Well, the main, I don't think institution is the right word, but they go in and destabilize the medical system, the international relations, the monetary system. And I think it's pretty obvious that this destabilization, you know, whether intentionally or unintentionally, I think probably intentionally, began in March of 2020 with COVID in the West.
Okay.
Mass
Destabilization in March of 2020?
Yes, I believe that's when it began in the West, to destabilize our economies, our the food supply, the
yeah, I can see that.
and international relations and education, all these main underpinnings and undergirdings of society being destabilized. So that's already been, over 3 years. So the third step in ideological subversion is crisis. And I hate to alarm you, but crisis, he says, takes 6 weeks. And step 4 is normalization. Your society has now fallen to a communist regime, and the process of normalization sets in. This is where Yuri Besmanov doesn't say this, but this is what part of normalization is: execution of dissidents, execution / imprisonment, arrest and imprisonment of dissidents or people who could potentially become dissidents. Will that happen here in America? I don't know, but that's what happens. That's the pattern that happens when communism takes over a society. This is why it's the deadliest form of government in the history of the world, because they engage in mass genocide of their own people. Mass murder, they're mass murderers.
And was this the same formula followed in other communist takeovers, the same steps? Or is this a formula created for American subversion specifically?
It's my understanding. So, I mean, the Soviet, how Russia fell to communism, I think is slightly different. I think there's a lot of overlap, but it was a very highly vulnerable populace. And it was a very unequal society, and they were able to use. I mean, there was some differences with the Soviet Union. They were also the first. They didn't even know what was hitting them until it was too late, way too late. China, I think it was more closely following this. I think this is the system that they were using from like the mid 20th century and on to go to the nations of the world. But I mean, we don't talk about this. As of 1985, 1/3 of the world's populace was living under a communist government.
Oh, wow. 1985, 1/3.
Yes, 1/3 of the world's population. And we're not just talking like, oh, the democratic socialists. No, we're talking like Marxist, Leninist, totalitarian communist regime. 1/3 of the world's population.
Well, I can see why communism would make a lot of sense for people who want to be able to control an orderly citizenry, because it allows for very easy centralized control.
Yeah. These people are power hungry monsters. People at the top of this. But I mean, it spread all through Latin America, all throughout Asia. It was huge parts of Europe, were locked in. And of course, America and Western Europe were kind of the hardest nuts to crack. And then there are some additional tactics that had to be developed to help America and the West to be more vulnerable to falling. And James Lindsay has taught about this ad nauseum with cultural Marxism, where they had to go in and they had to infiltrate from within 5 key institutions within the West. This is Antonio Gramsci in his writings, Italian Marxist, like 1920s or something. They had to go in and infiltrate because the West was resistant, wasn't falling to communism like it was supposed to. They had to infiltrate the legal system, the education, religion, the family, and media entertainment. And so that kind of goes right along with that. But that is how the Western society at this point is in such a precarious position with being, unless we like have a mass awakening, and I hope we can, I mean, we're in a very dangerous position. all of us in the West to falling to a communist regime. And then what will happen? Will it be exactly like what they've done in the past? We don't know. A lot of people are saying it's probably going to be more like the China system, where it's this surveillance state. And as long as you go along with the surveillance and go along with everything, it might look like your life is kind of normal-ish. But for dissidents, people that don't go along with that, that is not going to be good. I don't know how it's all going to shake down, but I'm just doing everything I can to be a part of waking up as many people as possible.
And what do you think? Is there anything that gives you optimism right now? Is there anything that you see as hopeful? And what do you think people can do right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think COVID was a huge wake-up call for a lot of people, and the
Was that a misstep?
Well, I mean, it was a miscalculation that I don't think it was planned for so many people to stand up to, the mandates and the various things. And it did wake up a lot of people. I mean, I think that we can prevent possibly some of the worst possible outcomes. I think we're so compromised at this point that we're going to go through some hard times regardless. But if we can, I think most importantly, is protect our children, protect our young people from being brainwashed and subverted to this. I'm homeschooling my son, and I plan to indefinitely. He's 8 years old, so we've got a lot of years ahead of us with that. And it's hard to protect our children from all of this, but we really have to teach them and train them. I do see reason for hope, and I'm working on the documentary version of my book that will hopefully, a lot of people don't want to sit down and read a lengthy book. I understand, but more people will watch a documentary. We're going to make our documentary free also, because we really have to reach as many people as possible. And I'm hoping we can reach, the target market for my book and for the documentary. It's Christians and it's parents of K through 12 students and anyone who cares about freedom. But I'm also hoping that there are some young people who are going into woke land that we can retrieve out of that before they get in too far. Once they're in really far, it's really hard. And Yuri Besmanov talks about this. When someone has been ideologically subverted, you can show them true information, and their brain cannot receive it. And hopefully we can get to some young people before they get to that point. But yeah, I mean, it's dark and heavy to talk about all of this, but we have to do it.
What do you see as the negative consequences if things do go the way that they look like they're going, with the ideology, the wokeness, the race and gender, and whatever else follows from that? What do you see as the potential negative outcome?
Quite a lot. I mean, so you had in China with the Red Guard, and you also had this in the Soviet Union, where you had this whole vast army of highly brainwashed and aggrieved people. And again, Marxism operates on, and Marxism is the playbook to subvert society to communism. It operates on grievance. And like you're oppressed and you've got to tear down the power of the oppressor class. And so anytime you see this grievance, drum being beat constantly, that's a red flag for you. What happened in the Soviet Union, they called it the dictatorship of the proletariat. The proletariat was the underclass, the economic underclass that was encouraged to rise up against their oppressor class, the bourgeois. And then in China, it was the dictatorship of the Red
Han were the bad guys, and because they were the dominant.
Yeah, well, it was the dictatorship of the young people that had been heavily brainwashed to go and to tear down the five olds.
Yeah.
And so what we have going on here, what I hope we can push back enough against it, the dictatorship of the woke is what I call it.
Okay.
So even if there's not like government laws, which there are in some places now, there's some states that if a parent doesn't want to transition their child to a different gender medically, that the state can then now here in America in some of our states take their child don't have to tell the parents where they are, and the state will transition them.
The governor of Washington just signed that
Yeah,
into, yeah.
that's pure insanity.
Yep.
Oh, and they'll take refugees. They'll take gender refugees from all 50 states.
Mhm. Mhm.
Whatever. I mean, that can't be allowed to continue. But a dictatorship of the woke, where the people with the bludgeons and with the boots on the ground, Antifa,
Mhm.
are terrorizing the populace to go along with this, to go along with, I mean, worst case scenario, and I hope we can prevent this. I think we can, but like, where they're instituting reparations, which is,
Mhm.
like, let's say $1 million per Black person who wasn't
Mhm.
even a slave themselves. And then now white people are this underclass, um, or white adjacent people. I guess that would also include Black people that don't want to go along with this, would be
Mhm.
considered white
Mhm.
adjacent.
Right.
Um, but where it's the aggrieved people that are wielding the weapons and terrorizing the populace to go along with this. And again, Antifa is kind of like the ultimate manifestation of that. And you look at Antifa, and a lot of them have a lot of gender confusion stuff. They seem to have a lot of that going on, and I think we'll see more and more of that.
Mhm.
And I feel badly for these people. I don't have a hatred for them. I
Mhm.
feel very badly. And a lot of these kids that fall into that are on the autism spectrum. I can't even blame them. They've been
Mhm.
demoralized. But I mean, we could just have where anyone who is for free speech and for our free society outlined in our Declaration of Independence, you wouldn't be able to express such views. You have to
Yeah.
like become a dissident and hide your views in
I
America.
just I just saw this. I was going to see if this was relevant to our conversation. I saw this morning, and it's exactly like stuff that we were provided when I was in the counseling program. This is about white culture and whiteness,
Yeah,
and this is just it just blows me
nuts.
away. This was provided by the Smithsonian, and
It's so
it talks about white culture, the rugged individualism, self-reliance, independence, and autonomy are valued and rewarded. Individuals are assumed to be in control of their environment. Family structure, the nuclear family, father, mother, and 2 to 3 children. Husband is the breadwinner, wife is the homemaker. Children should have their own rooms and be independent. These are
so
whiteness.
oppressive.
Yeah.
So oppressive is whiteness.
Emphasis on the scientific method. Now, this one's interesting. Objective, rational, linear thinking is whiteness. Cause and effect relationships, quantitative emphasis. History. History is of immigrants, Europeans, British Empire, Western, Greek, Roman, and Judeo-Christian. The Protestant work ethic. Hard work is the key to success. Work before play. Religion. Christianity is the norm. No tolerance for deviation from single God concept. And so on and so forth. Future orientation. Delayed gratification is whiteness. Planning for the future is whiteness. Following time schedules, and time being viewed as a commodity. Those are all whiteness. And so with so many things, I mean, some of those things are more specific, like specific historical references. It does make sense. That makes a little bit of sense to me. Like, that does have something to do with where people with light skin came from. There's the history that relates to those people's origin. Well, okay, that I'm with you. But saying that reason and rationality and scientific thinking and these things are whiteness and therefore bad, puts those things off limit, makes them disdainful for anybody to engage with. And that's telling people of all backgrounds and all ethnicities, these things are, you don't want to do these. Don't value the family structure. Don't value a family unit with a husband and wife and children. That's whiteness, and we don't want to do that. And so I don't know. I think that's pretty shocking. That's the material that I was being handed in a counselor education program as well. That one that I saw this morning wasn't from them, um, but it's
It's
the same kind of
insane.
stuff. Yeah.
I mean, and everything in that list, and I saw that also, it's everything that is a threat to the implementation of communism in America,
Mm-hmm.
because all of that is a structure that gives people a scaffolding to succeed
Mm-hmm.
and to have power.
Mm-hmm.
And in order for the communists to succeed, they need powerless, weak,
Mm-hmm.
irrational, brainwashed people who are unhealthy in every possible way.
Yeah.
And even like what was shocking for me, and again, completing my book and catching it up to date, there were some, if you remember, maybe you do Campus Crusade for Christ was kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's a college. It was a Christian ministry for colleges and universities back like 90s and 2000s,
Okay.
and they've rebranded themselves. You see it on videotape. They brought in people that are decrying the sin of whiteness.
Mm-hmm. Oh
Campus
gosh.
Crusade for Christ was like
Wow.
this like conservative evangelical Christian organization and ministry, kind
And
of
now
like, oh
it's
yeah,
woke. Yeah.
yeah. And it's
Yeah.
having the students like all in unison, like repent for the sin of whiteness.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Mm-hmm.
unreal.
Yeah, and I know I'm kind of jumping around now, but when you said a little while ago, you're talking about demoralization and the erosion of sexual morals.
Yeah.
I think I haven't really figured out how to think about this in the broader picture, but I've been thinking a lot about it as I've been having these conversations and watching what's happening right now.
Mhm.
And going it's all tied in. There's a thread that runs through all of it, and it seems to me that it's very anti-life,
Yeah.
that there's from what we talked about with the late term abortions now being fought for and legalized and celebrated, even
Yeah.
all the way through now I see you looking off. Do you need is your son present? Do you need, okay, because I don't want to say anything if you've got your kiddo there. I don't want to say
Yeah.
things that would be disturbing to a kid. But uh, the I don't know, the promotion of gender exploration, and
Yeah.
not just gender exploration, but also sexuality exploration in very young people, and asking very, very young people to think about sex, sexual pleasure, sexual orientation, just sexual activity at all, the instruction on ways of
Preschool.
exploring the body and in sexual ways.
Preschool.
Well, yeah,
Kindergarten.
it detaches it from any kind of potential meaning and value. You know, and again, I don't know where the line is drawn for different people and for different value systems. For what is what is what is sexual behavior for? Is it strictly for reproduction? Is it also somewhat recreational? Is it about connection and love? And what is it for? I don't know. But at this point, we've broken it down to the point where it's just about self-gratification, and that's it. It's about we can have as many partners as we want, and we can do it however we want, and nobody should kink shame us, because that's your thing. And it is, at that point, it's not that it is immoral, it's that it's amoral. It's just detached from morality at all.
Yeah.
And I guess I am still trying to figure out how to think about this, because I think that there's a thread of meaning, and I'm interested in different people's perspectives on this.
Yeah. Well, this is the way to maximally destabilize a society, is to subvert the young people, children, in this way
Mhm.
on a mass scale. And this was actually already tried by communists. They tried this in Hungary it was Lukács. He was a Hungarian communist. And in like the 1920s, he was trying to subvert Hungary to communism. And they went into the schools and they taught a very graphic sex education to
Mhm.
young children, and getting young children to try to, throw
In the
off.
1920s, you say?
Yes.
Okay.
And the people of Hungary ousted this. They were like, get out of our country.
Oh, wow.
We are not doing this. Um, Another experiment with this, another communist experiment, again, because it's maximally destabilizing to society. In the Soviet Union, they experimented with doing away with the family and
Mhm.
doing away with any kind of like, it was a sexual free for all. They were like, you don't need to get married to the peasants. You can just go and,
Mhm.
we'll take any babies that are born and the state will raise them. It was a massive failure. It, the state could not handle all these children.
Mhm.
no parents.
Mhm.
And, these peasants in the countryside, they were told, yeah, just go and just have fun,
Mhm.
you know, just cut off all of your previous moral, restraint.
Inhibitions, yeah.
Yeah. And but they found that it was so destabilizing that they couldn't continue with that experiment
Mm.
in the Soviet Union. And also they were encouraging homosexual relations at that time. And then the Soviet Union realized they had to go back to a traditional family and promotion of sexual fidelity.
And the
Uh,
problem was because too many children were born from
yeah,
that.
there was, but with no one to look after them, the state had to take control, and they could not manage
So
these
the
kids.
difference here is that now abortion is promoted and sterilization of minors is being promoted.
Yeah,
So,
but it is
okay.
but it's the maximally destabilizing thing that you can do to a society, is to subvert the young people in this way. And that's why this is another obvious clue to me. We're in the very, very late stages of this Marxist cultural revolution here in America. And that so many people, I was almost 40 when I had my son. So most mothers, I live here in Utah, most mothers with like a child my age. I mean, there's a few older women that have maybe like 4 or 5 older children and a child my age. But in terms of like people with like they have a child my age or younger, they're way younger than me.
Mhm.
Also, my mom was older when she had me, so I was raised with my mom grew up on a farm in rural Utah. I have old school values
Mhm.
in a lot of ways. It's shocking for me. I'm in this Facebook group and I see, and it's moms helping moms, and it's a lot of these women, and they're good people, but a lot of the women with the younger children are at this point, even in a conservative area of the country where I live, are totally on board with all of the gender and queer
Mhm.
Marxist stuff. Well,
Mhm.
they don't understand that it's
Mhm.
Marxist.
Mhm.
They're very
The
happy to,
younger people. Yeah.
yeah, that their children decide that they're a different gender. Okay, great.
Mhm.
Help and support you in that. And don't seem to have um, many issues with, um, you know, for instance, oh, you need to raise money. Well, go get an OnlyFans account, and you can,
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
you're a mom with 3 kids, but you go have your OnlyFans thing, and you can, bring in the bacon for
Mhm.
your family.
Mhm.
It's surprising to me, but I see a lot of moms of young kids now that their morals are unhinged,
Mhm.
in my opinion, and so their kids are very vulnerable to
Mhm.
this indoctrination going on in the
Mhm.
schools because their parents aren't even going to try to rein it in for them.
Mhm. Yeah, and that makes sense given that this re-education project started in the universities and
Yeah.
then, crept down the line. So people, younger people than us, I think we're about the same age.
Mhm.
Younger people, like I've talked about this when I went back to graduate school, I was really surprised by what was being taught. And I was also really surprised to look around the room and see that the people were chiming right in. They already knew the things to say, they knew the phrases to say,
Mhm.
and they were agreeing with it. And it had slipped by me because I'd had a break from academia,
Mhm.
and yet it had been a part of their academic diet for that intervening time. So
Right.
um,
Right.
very interesting. And
Yeah.
yeah, well, I feel like you've given me a lot to think about, and I really appreciate your perspective based on your experiences and your research.
Mhm.
And would you mind holding up your book for everybody to take a look at it?
Sure.
Beneath Sheep's Clothing. There it is. And if you can give me, I will put any links down
Yeah.
under this video, and so people can find out where to buy your book and where to watch the trailer for your documentary that you're working on. And if they want to contribute to that project, they can help you fund that, because I think that's going to be a really interesting project to watch.
Yeah. My website is beneathsheepsclothing.com, and I'll send that to you. My book, you can link to it. Well, if you click on the book there to buy it, it will link you to my Amazon
Okay.
account to buy the book. And the trailer is at beneathsheepsclothing.com as well. I'm asking anyone who thinks that this information is important to get out, even a $15 donation is very
Mhm.
helpful. We're looking for some larger contributors as well. And we have some perks to offer businesses or people that contribute 5,000, 20,000, but $15 is still great. Um, we definitely need funding. My filmmaker has been working for free so far, and he has a family to support. So we're working really hard to fundraise right now. And thank you for letting me share that. But any contributions that people have would be very, very helpful. And there's links to my Give Send Go right there on my website for people to donate if they would like to see this project become a reality.
Excellent. Well, and I hope that it does, and I look forward to watching it when it's ready.
Thanks so
And
much.
yeah, thank you so much, Julie. I appreciate your time today.
Yeah, it was great to talk to you.
Good to talk to you too.